The Oldsmobile Jetway 707 is hands down the strangest vehicle I've ever featured on this channel. When I first saw it, I thought it had to be fake, either a wild digital rendering or some bizarre concept car that GM dreamed up. After all, GM has a long history of coming up with crazy ideas, and they still do. But as it turns out, this wasn't just some Photoshop creation, so maybe it was a one-off prototype. Nope, not that either. And it wasn't some backyard build put together by a hobbyist there. There was actually a whole company behind it. And believe it or not, this wasn't just a one-off experiment. This was a full-blown production effort. The origins of Cotner and Bevington. Let's rewind to 1959. That's when Waldo Cotner and Robert Bevington teamed up to create the Cotner and Bevington Corporation in Beeville, Arkansas. They built a modern factory and started converting a handful of Chevrolets and Buicks before ultimately focusing on Oldsmobiles. One of their standout creations was a budget-friendly coach called the Civil, which set itself apart by having a shorter wheelbase, making it more fuel-efficient and faster than the competition. For a few years they kept things going, but Cotner and Bevington was never a large-scale operation. They weren't a major automaker, just a small firm specializing in conversions. That's not to say their work was bad. In fact, it was pretty impressive. They just didn't have the capital to expand. Then in 1965, they caught the attention of Divco Corporation. Divco had been around for over a century and was best known for its school bus conversions at the time. They also owned Miller Meteor, the company responsible for Cadillac-based ambulances, including the one that became the famous Ecto one from Ghostbusters. Divco ended up buying out Cotner and Bevington, and the company shifted its focus to helping build Cadillac coaches. But after about a year, Divco decided that Cotner and Bevington should stick with Oldsmobiles. Their reasoning: they wanted Oldsmobiles to be the more affordable alternative to Cadillac, allowing them to reach a broader market. So, from that point forward, Cotner and Bevington worked exclusively with the Oldsmobile 98 platform. The influence of the Tornado. Then came 1966, and this is where things really start to get interesting that year. Oldsmobile introduced the Tornado, and it was a game-changer. The design, the technology, the drivetrain, the sheer presence. It was bold, futuristic, and unlike anything else on the road. Cotner and Bevington saw an opportunity. They came up with an entire lineup of ambulances, hearses, and limousines based on the Tornado's platform. Excited about the potential, they took their plans to Miller Meteor's executives and pitched the idea. The response: a hard-no. Miller Meteor didn't want Cotner and Bevington stepping into their territory. The Oldsmobile 98 was one thing. It was similar to a Cadillac, but not quite the same. A Toronado-based coach, on the other hand, would be a direct competitor to Miller Meteor's Cadillac conversions, and they weren't about to let that happen. At this point, Waldo and Robert were still technically running the Beale plant, but as stakeholders they had no real power, so they made a bold move. They sold their stock, left the company, and started a brand new venture. Since Divco still owned the Cotner and Bevington name, they had to come up with something different. They landed on American Quality Coach, or AQC. Meanwhile, Cotner and Bevington continued to operate under DivCo's ownership until 1975, but we'll get to that later, with the money from selling their shares. Waldo and Robert bought back the same plant where they had started in 1959, their first project under their new company, the Jetway 707. The Jetway 707. A Leo unlike any other built on the Tornado platform, the Jetway 707 was a 28-long, 8-door, 15-passenger beast. And while it might seem like a completely wild concept, AQC wasn't the only company making stretched-out people movers. Checker Motors Corporation was also in the game. Checker, famous for its taxis, had been around since the 1920s. One of their lesser-known creations was the Checker Erebus, introduced in 1962. About 3,600 were built using Chrysler and GM engines. These were essentially airport shuttles, which is where the name Erebus came from. Going back even further, in the 1940s, there were Cadillac-based airport limos. Stageway was another major player in the conversion industry, and they too built airport limousines. So what AQC was doing with the Jetway, 707 wasn't completely out of left field. The key difference: unlike other stretch limos, the Jetway had more doors and more individual seating. What made the Jetway 707 unique, one thing that made the Jetway 707 truly stand out, was its six-wheel design, a first for stretched vehicles. AQC achieved this by adding twin rear axles, making it the first known stretched limo to feature them. The Jetway 707 had a 185 in wheelbase compared to the Toronado 119 in wheelbase. It had a total of 9 doors, including the rear hatch, and could seat 12 to 15 passengers depending on the configuration. The name 707 was a direct nod to the Boeing 707, and keeping with the aviation theme, passengers sat in individual bucket seats. AQC claimed the vehicle had 100 cubic feet of storage space in the back, but people who actually rode in them said storage was pretty limited in terms of design. The Jetway didn't look anything like a traditional limousine such as the Fleetwood Series 75, and that was intentional. Waldo and Robert didn't want it to be seen as just another stretched limo. One of their ads even emphasized that it was the only coach specifically designed for this many passengers in individual foam upholstered seats. One of my favorite design elements of the Jetway 707 is the raised roof with integrated skylights similar to what you'd find on an Oldsmobile Vista cruiser. It wasn't just for aesthetics, it made the cabin feel more open and airy. Power and performance: while I couldn't find official weight specs for this behemoth, one thing's for sure: it needed serious power under the hood. It retained the Toronado 7.5-liter or 455 cubic inch rocket V8, which made 375 horsepower and 510 pound-feet of torque. The engine was part of Oldsmobile's unitized power package up a front-wheel drive system that took 7 years to develop. This setup was so well engineered that it remained mostly unchanged for GMC's motorhomes in the mid-1970s. The front-wheel drive layout also meant a completely flat floor, giving passengers more space and comfort. The downfall: initially AQC planned to build 300 units of the Jetway, is one of the most bizarre yet fascinating vehicles I've come across. That's it for this week. Hope you all have a great one.